Deep in the Montana wilderness, where pine trees stretched toward heaven and silence ruled the land, Ezra Cole tracked a wounded elk through snow that crunched beneath his weathered boots. The trail led him higher than he'd ever ventured, past familiar hunting grounds into territory that felt untouched by time itself. That's when he saw it, a massive log structure nestled between ancient pines, its roof sagging under decades of neglect. The Mountain View Lodge, according to faded letters carved above the door. Ezra had heard whispers of this place in town, stories dismissed as frontier folklore. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of golden light, filtering through broken windows. But what stopped Ezra Cole wasn't the decay. It was the child's wooden toy sitting perfectly preserved on a stone hearth, as if someone had just set it down yesterday. What secret had this forgotten place been keeping for all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ezra Cole had been living alone in these mountains for 7 years, ever since he'd returned from Afghanistan, with wounds that went deeper than the shrapnel scars on his left shoulder. The military had taught him to survive in hostile territory, but nothing had prepared him for surviving the memories that followed him home like hungry wolves. His cabin sat 3 miles down the mountain, a simple structure he'd built with his own hands from timber he'd cut and seasoned. It was far enough from civilization that he could go weeks without seeing another soul, which was exactly how he preferred it. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, was a 2-hour hike through rough terrain, and he made the journey only when his supplies ran low or when the winter storms made hunting impossible. The lodge before him was unlike anything he'd encountered in his years of wandering these peaks. It was massive, built from logs that must have taken a dozen men to move. The craftsmanship spoke of an era when things were built to last generations, not just seasons. Whoever had constructed this place had intended it to stand against whatever the mountains could throw at. Ezra circled the building slowly, his trained eyes cataloging details that others might miss. The foundation stones were solid granite, perfectly fitted without mortar. The windows, though broken now, had once been quality glass with hand-carved frames. This wasn't some rough shelter thrown up by prospectors or loggers. This was someone's dream made real. He found the main entrance on the south side, where a heavy wooden door hung slightly ajar. The hinges were rusted, but still functional. Ezra pushed the door open with a prolonged creak that echoed through the empty structure, like a mournful song. Inside, the air smelled of decades of dust and neglect, with undertones of wood smoke that suggested the fireplace had been used long after the lodge was abandoned. The main room was enormous, with a vaulted ceiling supported by massive beams. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth large enough to roast an entire deer. Ezra's eyes swept the room methodically, the way he'd been trained to clear buildings in hostile territory. Old furniture sat covered in dust and mouse droppings. A few pieces looked salvageable, a heavy oak table, some chairs that might hold weight if the joints were tightened. But it was what sat on a smaller table near the fireplace that drew his attention. A leather-bound book, thick and well-made, lay open as if someone had been reading it recently. Ezra approached cautiously, his boots echoing in the vast space. The book was a guest registry, its pages yellowed with age but still legible. He flipped through the entries, reading names and dates that stretched back to the night. Most entries were brief. Families from distant cities seeking mountain air and adventure, businessmen looking to escape the pressures of post-war America, couples on honeymoons who wanted to experience the wild frontier. The handwriting varied from elegant script to rough block letters, each entry a small window into lives lived decades ago. Then he found it, the last entry dated September 15. The Morrison family, James, Mary and Sarah. A new beginning in God's country. May this place bring us the peace we've been seeking. And J.M. Ezra stared at the words, noting how the handwriting was careful but shaky, as if written by someone under stress. The date was significant too, September 8th to 71 years ago, yet the entry looked as if it had been written yesterday. He flipped through the remaining pages, but they were all blank. Whatever had happened to the Morrison family, they had been the last guests to sign this book. The question was why no one had come after them. Ezra ran his fingers over the entry, feeling the slight indentation the pen had made in the paper. James Morrison. The name seemed familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have heard it. Mary and Sarah Morrison, a family seeking a new beginning, just like so many others who had fled to these mountains over the decades. The wooden toy on the hearth suddenly took on new significance. It was a child's plaything, carved with obvious care and skill. Sarah Morrison would have been young enough to play with toys in 1952. Had she left this behind when the family departed, or had something prevented them from taking their belongings with them? Ezra closed the registry carefully and looked around the room with new eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a mystery waiting to be solved. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally arrived with the fury that only mountain weather could deliver. Wind howled through the broken windows, and snow began to fall in thick, heavy flakes that would make travel treacherous within hours. Ezra had planned to return to his cabin before dark, but nature had other plans. He moved through the lodge methodically, checking for structural damage and assessing whether it would provide adequate shelter for the night. The roof held firm despite its sagging appearance, and most of the windows still had enough glass to keep out the worst of the wind. It would do. As he explored the rooms beyond the main hall, Ezra's boots echoed on wide plank floors that creaked but felt solid beneath his weight. The lodge was larger than it had appeared from outside. A kitchen with an old wood-burning stove occupied one wing, while the other contained what looked like guest quarters. Upstairs, he could see the outline of more rooms in the gathering darkness. It was while examining the floorboards in what might have once been a dining room that Ezra noticed something odd. One section of planking didn't quite align with the rest, as if it had been removed and replaced. He knelt and ran his fingers along the edges, feeling the slight gap that betrayed recent disturbance. His military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him that someone had hidden something beneath these boards. Using his hunting knife, he pried at the loose section until it lifted free, revealing a shallow space carved into the floor joists below. Inside was a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth, preserved against moisture and time. Ezra lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside had been important enough to hide and protect with considerable care. The cloth fell away to reveal a leather journal bound with a cord that had once been white but had yellowed with age. The cover was embossed with the initials MM in elegant script. Mary Morrison. Ezra felt his pulse quicken as he realized he was holding what might be the key to understanding what had happened to the family whose name was the last entry in the guest registry. He carried the journal to the main room, where the fading daylight provided better illumination. The pages were filled with careful handwriting in faded blue ink. The first entry was dated September 1. James believes this place will be our salvation. After everything that happened in Chicago, perhaps he's right. The children need a fresh start, especially Sarah. She hasn't been the same since the incident. Ezra turned pages carefully, reading entries that painted a picture of a family fleeing something dark in their past. Mary Morrison wrote of James's nightmares, of their daughter Sarah's fear of strangers, of creditors and threats that had driven them from their previous life. September 8, 1952. The lodge is everything James promised. Sarah played by the creek today and actually smiled. It's the first time I've seen her truly happy since we left Chicago. James thinks we can make a go of it here, running the lodge as a business. I want to believe him. September 12, 1952. Strange men came asking questions in town today. James says they were just passing through, but I saw the way they looked at him. The same way those men in Chicago looked at him before everything went wrong. I pray I'm mistaken. September 14, 1952. James won't tell me everything, but I know we're in danger. He's been cleaning his rifle and checking the doors twice each night. Sarah can sense the tension. She started carrying that wooden horse everywhere. the one James carved for her last Christmas. I've hidden this journal where only I can find it, in case something happens to it. The final entry was dated September 15, 1952, the same date as their registration in the guest book. They found us. James is trying to negotiate, but I can see in their eyes that they didn't come here to talk. I'm going to hide Sarah in the root cellar behind the kitchen. If anyone finds this journal and we're not here to explain, please know that we tried to build something good in this place. We tried to start over. God help us all. Ezra stared at the last entry until the words blurred in the fading light. The journal trembled slightly in his hands, though whether from emotion or the cold wind whipping through the broken windows, he couldn't say. Mary Morrison's words painted a clear picture. The family hadn't left the lodge voluntarily. Something had happened to them on that September night, 71 years ago. Outside, the storm raged with increasing intensity, and Ezra realized he would be spending the night in the lodge whether he wanted to or not. But now, instead of seeking mere shelter, he found himself the guardian of a mystery that had waited 7 decades to be solved. Ezra built a fire in the massive stone hearth, using dry wood he found stacked beside the fireplace, apparently left by the lodge's last occupants. The flames cast dancing shadows across the room as he settled back to read more of Mary Morrison's journal by firelight. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. As he turned pages, a metallic clinking sound caught his attention. Something had fallen from between the journal's pages onto the floor. In the flickering firelight, he saw 2 metal discs connected by a chain. Dog tags. Ezra picked them up with hands that suddenly felt unsteady. Military identification tags, worn smooth by years of handling. He held them close to the fire to read the stamped information. Morrison, James P. Serial number 37449821. Blood type O. Religion Protestant. The bottom line made Ezra's blood run cold. Next of kin, Mary Morrison, Chicago, Illinois. But it wasn't just the tags themselves that shook him. It was the unit designation stamped in small letters along the edge. 82nd Airborne Division, 5th Hour of 1st Parachute Infantry Regiment. Ezra knew that unit. He'd studied its history extensively during his own military service because his grandfather, Sergeant Thomas Cole, had served with the 505th. The 505th had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, fought through the hedgerows of France, and later participated in Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands. His grandfather had told him stories about the war, about the men he'd served with, about the bonds forged in combat that lasted long after the shooting stopped. Thomas Cole had been proud of his service, but haunted by it too, especially in his later years when age loosened his tongue and old memories surfaced like debris from a sunken ship. Ezra tried to remember if his grandfather had ever mentioned a James Morrison, but the name remained frustratingly just out of reach. There had been so many stories, so many names of men who had lived and died in places most people couldn't pronounce. His grandfather had kept a box of letters and photographs from his war years, but Ezra hadn't looked at them since the old man's funeral 15 years ago. Holding James Morrison's dog tags, Ezra felt a connection that transcended the decades between them. Both men had served their country in foreign wars. Both had come home carrying invisible wounds. Both had sought refuge in these mountains, though apparently with very different outcomes. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney while Ezra continued reading Mary's journal entries. James Morrison's war service explained some things about the family's situation. Many veterans had struggled to readjust to civilian life after the war. Some, like Ezra himself, found cities too crowded, too noisy, too full of people who couldn't understand what they'd seen and done. From Mary's entries, it became clear that James had been having difficulties. Nightmares, drinking, problems holding steady employment. The move to Montana had been presented as a business opportunity, a chance to run the Mountain View Lodge as a going concern. But reading between the lines, Ezra could see it was really an escape from creditors, from failed ventures, from a life that had gone wrong in ways that military service hadn't prepared James to handle. September 10, 1952. James had another episode last night. He was back in France, calling out warnings to men who died years ago. Sarah heard him and came to our room crying. I don't know how to explain to a child why her father sometimes forgets where he is. September 11, 1952. Found James sitting by the creek this morning, just staring at the water. He had his dog tags in his hands, rubbing them like a rosary. When I asked what he was thinking about, he said he was remembering the good men who didn't make it home. Sometimes I think he wishes he'd been one of them. Ezra understood that sentiment better than he cared to admit. There had been nights in his own cabin when he'd wondered why he'd survived Afghanistan when better men than him hadn't. Survivor's guilt was a burden that military training never addressed, a weight that some veterans carried until they found a way to set it down or until it crushed them entirely. The wind howled through the broken windows, and snow began to accumulate on the sills. Ezra added another log to the fire and wrapped himself in his heavy coat. Tomorrow, if the storm cleared, he would return to his cabin and try to forget about the Morrison family mystery. But even as he told himself this, Ezra knew he was lying. James Morrison's dog tags felt warm in his palm, as if they retained some trace of the man who had worn them into battle decades ago. Morning light filtered through the broken windows, revealing the lodge in stark detail. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow. Ezra stretched stiff muscles and rekindled the fire to warm coffee from his pack. He'd slept fitfully, his dreams filled with images of a family he'd never met, but somehow felt compelled to understand. Before leaving, he decided to explore the upper floor. The wooden stairs groaned under his weight but held firm. At the top, a narrow hallway led to 4 guest rooms, each furnished with simple beds and dressers. Dust motes danced in the morning sunlight that streamed through windows facing the valley below. The last room at the end of the hall felt different from the others, more personal. This had been the Morrison family's room during their brief stay. A double bed dominated the space, with a smaller cot pushed against one wall where young Sarah would have slept. On the dresser, Ezra found what he was looking for without knowing he'd been searching. A silver frame held a family photograph. The glass cracked, but the image still clear. James Morrison stood behind his wife and daughter, his hand resting protectively on Mary's shoulder. He was a tall man, with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair. Mary was petite and pretty, with a smile that suggested happiness, despite the troubles Mary had written about in her journal. Between them stood Sarah, perhaps 8 years old, clutching the same wooden horse that Ezra had found downstairs. But it was James Morrison's face that held Ezra's attention. There was something familiar about the man's features, something that nagged at the edges of memory. The eyes, perhaps, or the set of his jaw. Ezra had seen that face before, but where? He studied the photograph more carefully, noting details that might provide clues. James wore civilian clothes, but his posture was unmistakably military. His haircut, though growing out, showed the discipline of a man accustomed to regulations. Most telling of all were his hands, visible where they rested on his family. The left hand bore a ring, but the right showed the telltale calluses of someone who'd spent years handling weapons. Mary Morrison looked directly at the camera, with an expression that seemed almost defiant, as if she were daring the world to harm her family. She wore a simple dress and a strand of pearls that suggested middle-class respectability, but her eyes held awareness that spoke of recent hardships. Sarah was the image of her mother, with the same delicate features and direct gaze. But there was something in the child's expression that troubled Ezra, a guardedness that no 8-year-old should possess, a premature understanding of the world's danger. The photograph had been taken in what looked like a professional studio, probably in Chicago, before the family's flight to Montana. It was the kind of portrait that families commissioned for special occasions or to mark new beginnings. Perhaps James and Mary had intended it as a record of their fresh start, never imagining it would become the only evidence of their existence. Ezra carefully removed the photograph from its frame and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He told himself he was preserving evidence, but the truth was more complicated. Looking at the Morrison family, he saw echoes of the life he'd never had. The wife who'd waited for letters that stopped coming after his third deployment. The children who might have been, if he'd been able to stay in one place long enough to build something lasting. In the drawer of the bedside table, he found other remnants of their brief occupancy. Mary's reading glasses, folded carefully in a leather case, a small bottle of James's aftershave, the scent still faintly detectable after 7 decades. Sarah's hair ribbons, faded blue silk that spoke of a mother's care in maintaining feminine touches, even in wilderness isolation. These intimate objects affected Ezra more than he'd expected. They transformed the Morrison family from names in a guest registry to real people who'd slept in this bed, looked out these windows, and planned for a future that would never come. He descended the stairs slowly, his mind working through the implications of what he'd discovered. The photograph confirmed that the Morrison family had existed, had been real people with hopes and fears like anyone else. But it also raised new questions. Why had no one come looking for them when they disappeared? Surely a family didn't simply vanish without someone noticing, asking questions, demanding answers. Standing in the main room where sunlight now revealed every detail of decay and abandonment, Ezra made a decision that would change the trajectory of his solitary existence. He was going to find out what had happened to James, Mary, and Sarah Morrison, even if the truth had been buried for 71 years. The small bedroom at the back of the lodge had clearly belonged to Sarah Morrison. Unlike the other rooms, this one retained touches that spoke of a child's presence. A quilt with faded flowers, a small rocking chair positioned by the window, and books stacked neatly on a shelf, built low enough for young hands to reach. Ezra approached the room with something approaching reverence. Children's spaces held a sanctity that even decades of abandonment couldn't diminish. Here, an 8-year-old girl had slept her last nights, played her final games, and perhaps sensed the approaching darkness that would claim her family. The books on the shelf were a mixture of children's classics and school primers: Treasure Island, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and several volumes of fairy tales with illustrations that had once been bright, but were now faded to pastels. Between Black Beauty and a collection of Mother Goose rhymes, Ezra found a composition book with Sarah Morrison, Grade 3, written in careful cursive on the cover. Inside, the pages held the earnest efforts of a bright child working to master language, arithmetic problems with gold stars for correct answers, spelling lists copied in neat rows. But it was the creative writing assignments that caught Ezra's attention, particularly an essay titled "What I Want to Be When I Grow Up." Sarah's handwriting was careful but enthusiastic, the letters slightly uneven in the way of children still mastering the mechanics of forming words. "When I grow up, I want to be a veterinarian because animals get hurt and scared just like people do, but they can't tell anyone what's wrong. My daddy says that helping others is the most important thing a person can do. He helped people in the war even when it was dangerous. Mama says I have gentle hands like hers and that I would be good at taking care of sick animals. Last week I had a baby bird with a broken wing. Mama helped me make a little box for it, and we fed it with a tiny spoon until it got better. When we let it go, it flew right back to its mother in the big pine tree behind our house. That made me feel happy inside, like when Daddy comes home from one of his trips and smiles at Mama and me. Sometimes Daddy has bad dreams about the war and he calls out in his sleep. I think he needs someone to take care of him too, like we took care of the baby bird. Maybe when I'm a veterinarian I can help people and animals both feel better." Ezra set the composition book down carefully, his throat tight with emotion. Sarah Morrison had possessed the kind of empathy that would have made her an exceptional healer, given the chance to grow up. Her understanding of her father's struggles was remarkable for a child so young, showing a maturity born of difficult circumstances. Further into the notebook, he found other assignments that painted a picture of a thoughtful, caring child. A story about a family of rabbits who had to find a new home when their meadow was threatened by a forest fire. A poem about missing her grandmother in Chicago. A drawing of the lodge with stick figures representing her family, all holding hands in front of the massive log structure. But it was the final entry that stopped Ezra cold. It was dated September 14, 1952. Just one day before the family's final guest registry entry. Today I heard Mama and Daddy talking in whispers again. They do that when something bad might happen. Daddy cleaned his rifle and put it by the door. He told me to stay close to the lodge and not go down to the creek alone anymore. I'm scared, but I don't want Mama and Daddy to know because they're already worried enough. I've been carrying my wooden horse everywhere because it makes me feel safe. Daddy made it for me special and he said it would always protect me. If something happens to us, I hope someone finds this book and knows that we were happy here for a little while. Mama smiled more than she had in months, and Daddy's bad dreams weren't as often. This lodge felt like home in a way nowhere else ever did. I drew a picture of us under my bed where no one will find it unless they look really hard. That way, even if we have to leave, our picture will still be here, and part of us will always live in this place. Ezra knelt beside the small bed and felt underneath the frame. His fingers found a folded piece of paper, brittle with age. Sarah's drawing showed the three of them standing in front of the lodge, but in this version they had wings like angels, and the wooden horse stood beside them, also winged. A child's innocent attempt to ensure her family's immortality had succeeded in ways she never could have imagined. The kitchen of the Mountain View Lodge retained the functionality of its original design despite decades of neglect. Cast iron pans still hung from hooks beside a wood-burning stove that could have fed dozens of guests. But it was the small office space tucked behind the pantry that yielded the next piece of the Morrison puzzle. James Morrison had used this cramped room as his business headquarters during the family's brief residency. A roll-top desk sat against one wall, its drawers mostly empty but for dust and mouse droppings. However, in the back of the bottom drawer, Ezra found a manila envelope containing a collection of letters that painted a disturbing picture of the family's final weeks. The earliest letter was dated August 20, 1952, written on expensive letterhead from Blackwood Timber Corporation, Cedar Falls, Montana. It was addressed to James Morrison and signed by someone named R. Blackwood. Mr. Morrison, I trust you are settling into your new venture at the Mountain View Lodge. I wanted to personally welcome you to our community and discuss a business proposition that could benefit us both. As you may know, Blackwood Timber holds logging rights to much of the surrounding forests. The tract your lodge sits on would make an excellent addition to our operation. I am prepared to offer you a generous sum for the property, well above what you paid for it. Please consider this carefully, as opportunities like this don't come along often in these remote areas. The tone was cordial, but held an undercurrent of expectation. This wasn't really a request, so much as an opening gambit in what would become an increasingly hostile negotiation. James Morrison's typed response, carbon copy filed with the original letter, was polite but firm. Miss Blackwood, thank you for your interest in the Mountain View Lodge property. However, my family and I have invested everything in making this venture successful. We plan to operate the lodge for many years to come, and are not interested in selling at this time. I hope you understand our position. Blackwood's next letter, dated September 3, showed a marked shift in tone. Mr. Morrison, I'm disappointed by your response to my generous offer. Perhaps you don't fully understand the challenges of operating a business in this isolated location. Supplies must be trucked in over difficult roads. Equipment breaks down. Accidents happen. A man with a family should consider these risks carefully. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. James Morrison was being told that his refusal to sell would have consequences. Morrison's response was shorter and cooler. Miss Blackwood, my family and I are well aware of the challenges mountain living presents. We are prepared to face them. Please respect our decision to remain. The final letter in the sequence chilled Ezra to the bone. Dated September 12, 1952, just 3 days before the Morrison family's disappearance, it abandoned all pretense of civility. Morrison, you've made a serious mistake. This mountain doesn't have room for people who don't know their place. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Consider this your final warning. There was no signature on this letter, but the Blackwood Timber letterhead left no doubt about its origin. Ezra sat back in the cramped office, pieces of a 71-year-old crime falling into place. The Morrison family hadn't simply disappeared. They'd been murdered by R. Blackwood, or his associates, because James Morrison had refused to sell land that Blackwood wanted for timber operations. But if that was true, why had no investigation been conducted? A family of 3 couldn't vanish without someone asking questions. There should have been police reports, newspaper articles, some record of official concern about their fate, unless the local authorities had been compromised. Unless Blackwood's influence extended beyond timber rights into law enforcement and local government. In the 1950s, in remote areas like this, a wealthy businessman could wield enormous power. If Blackwood controlled the sheriff's department, judges, even the local newspaper, he could make a family disappear from official record as easily as he'd made them disappear from life. Ezra studied the letters again, noting details that might provide clues about Blackwood's identity and current status. The business address was in Cedar Falls, the same town where Ezra bought supplies. If Blackwood timber still existed, there might be records, descendants, people who remembered the events of 1952. The wooden horse that Sarah Morrison had cherished sat on the kitchen counter where Ezra had placed it. In the afternoon light streaming through dusty windows, it looked less like a child's toy and more like evidence in a murder case that had gone cold for 7 decades. A murder case that now had an unlikely investigator, a solitary mountain man who understood what it meant to be hunted by forces beyond his control. The root cellar Mary Morrison had mentioned in her final journal entry was exactly where she'd described it, behind the kitchen, accessible through a heavy wooden door that had warped with decades of moisture, but still held firm. Ezra had to use his shoulder to force it open, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness. The air below was cool and thick with the smell of earth and time. Ezra used his flashlight to illuminate the space, revealing stone walls lined with empty shelving where the lodge's food supplies would have been stored. But in the far corner, behind what had once been a barrel of flour, he found Mary Morrison's final hiding place. A wooden crate, small enough for a frightened woman to move quickly, contained items that told the story of a family's desperate last hours. Mary had gathered things she deemed most important: family photographs, important documents, and a collection of pressed flowers arranged in a scrapbook with handwritten notes. The botanical collection was extensive and revealed a side of Mary Morrison that hadn't emerged from her journal entries. She had been a serious amateur naturalist, documenting the mountain flora with scientific precision. Each pressed specimen was labeled with its common name, scientific designation, location where found, and date of collection. But it was Mary's personal notes accompanying each flower that transformed the collection from hobby to hidden testimony. Written in a careful code that used botanical terminology to disguise their true meaning, the entries documented the Morrison family's growing fear and the evidence they were gathering against their persecutors. Aconitum columbianum, monkshud, found near the North Trail, September. Highly toxic if ingested. Note: 3 strangers asking questions about the family in town. Jim thinks they're working for B. They know too much about our Chicago troubles. Delphinium elatum, larkspur. Beautiful but dangerous to livestock, September. Note: tire tracks near our water source this morning. Someone's been watching the lodge. Jim found cigarette butts behind the big pine. Same brand B's men smoked in town. Cichota maculata, water hemlock, most poisonous plant in North America, September. Note: they cut our telephone line last night. Jim says it could have been animals, but we both know better. Sarah asked why we're whispering all the time. How do you tell a child her world is ending? The final entry was dated September 14, the day before the family's disappearance. Amanita phalloides, death cap mushroom. Beautiful, but absolutely lethal. No known antidote. Note: they came openly today. B himself, with 3 of his men, told Jim he had until tomorrow night to sign the deed over. Said it would be unfortunate if anything happened to a family in such an isolated location. I'm hiding this record where they'll never find it. If we don't survive, at least someone will know who killed us. Ezra studied Mary's botanical code with growing admiration. She had been clever enough to create a record of threats and surveillance that would look innocent to casual observers, but told a clear story to anyone who understood what they were reading. Each flower's toxic properties seemed to mirror her family's increasingly dangerous situation. But Mary Morrison had been more than just clever. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in oiled cloth like her journal had been, Ezra found photographs that documented everything. Pictures of men watching the lodge from the tree line, license plates of vehicles that didn't belong in the area, even a photograph of R. Blackwood himself, apparently taken with a telephoto lens from inside the lodge. The photograph of Blackwood was particularly revealing. He was a large man, with expensive clothes and the kind of confident bearing that came from never being told no. But it was his companions that made Ezra's blood run cold. 3 men in suits that didn't quite fit, with the hard faces and careful postures of professional killers. Mary had somehow managed to document a conspiracy that reached far beyond a simple business dispute. These weren't local toughs hired to intimidate a stubborn family. These were serious criminals, the kind who made people disappear permanently and professionally. The final item in Mary's hidden cache was a letter addressed simply to whoever finds this. The envelope had never been sealed, as if Mary had intended to add more to it if time allowed. My name is Mary Elizabeth Morris. My husband James and daughter Sarah and I came to the Mountain View Lodge seeking a new beginning. Instead, we found death awaiting. R. Blackwood, of Blackwood Timber Corporation, has threatened our lives because we won't sell him our property. If you're reading this, it means he carried out his threats. Please don't let our murders go unavenged. Please remember that we were here, that we mattered, that we loved each other until the very end. Ezra carefully rewrapped Mary's evidence and carried it up from the root cellar. In the kitchen, surrounded by the mundane remnants of interrupted lives, he spread the photographs and documents across the table. Mary Morrison had created a detailed record of her family's killers, hidden it where only the most thorough search would uncover it. Now, 71 years later, someone had finally found it. The massive stone fireplace had been built to last centuries, with a chimney that drew perfectly and a hearth wide enough to accommodate logs the size of telephone poles. But it was while cleaning out decades of accumulated debris that Ezra made a discovery that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the Morrison family tragedy. Behind a loose stone in the chimney's back wall, hidden where only someone cleaning or repairing the fireplace would find it, was a small cloth bundle. Inside the cloth, wrapped with the same careful attention to preservation that had protected Mary Morrison's journal, was a tarnished sheriff's badge. Ezra held the star-shaped piece of metal up to the afternoon light streaming through the broken windows. Despite 70 years of neglect, the engraving was still clearly legible. Sheriff, Cedar Falls County, Montana. And below that, in smaller letters, Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole. His grandfather. Ezra sank into one of the dusty chairs, the badge heavy in his palm, despite weighing only a few ounces. His grandfather had been the sheriff of Cedar Falls County in 1952. Thomas Cole had been the law enforcement official responsible for investigating the Morrison family's disappearance. But there had been no investigation, no police reports, no search parties, no official concern about a missing family, which meant his grandfather had been involved in the cover-up, either willingly or through coercion. The implications hit Ezra like a physical blow. His grandfather, the man who had taught him about duty and honor, who had filled his childhood with stories of heroism and service, had been complicit in the murder of an innocent family. Or perhaps worse than complicit. Perhaps Thomas Cole had been an active participant in their deaths. Ezra tried to reconcile this revelation with his memories of the old man who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. Thomas Cole had been stern but loving, a man who insisted on moral absolutes and personal responsibility. He had spoken often about the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, about standing up to bullies and corrupt officials. Had it all been lies? The bedtime stories about brave lawmen standing against overwhelming odds? The lessons about right and wrong that had shaped Ezra's own moral compass? Had his grandfather been trying to teach him values he himself had abandoned when it mattered most? But even as these dark thoughts consumed him, Ezra found himself searching for alternative explanations. His grandfather had been a good man, stern, yes, but fundamentally decent. There had to be more to the story than simple corruption or cowardice. Behind the fireplace stone where he'd found the badge, Ezra discovered something else. A folded piece of paper, yellow with age and brittle to the touch. His grandfather's handwriting, unmistakable even after all these years, filled the page. September's God, forgive me for what I'm about to do. Blackwood came to my office today with 3 of his men and photographs of my wife, hanging laundry in our backyard, my daughter walking to school, my son playing in the front yard. He didn't need to say what would happen to them if I didn't cooperate. The Morrison family is dead. I know this without seeing the bodies. Blackwood's men killed them last night, probably buried them somewhere in the deep woods where they'll never be found. My job is to make sure no one asks questions, no investigation gets started, no official record exists of their disappearance. I could fight him, could try to expose what happened, bring federal authorities in to investigate. But I've seen what happens to men who cross Blackwood. They disappear too, along with their families. I have 3 children to protect, a wife who depends on me. Is it worth sacrificing 4 lives to seek justice for 3 who are already gone? I'm hiding my badge here because I don't deserve to wear it anymore. A real lawman would find a way to do what's right without endangering innocence. A real lawman wouldn't choose his own family over justice. But I'm not a real lawman. I'm just a man who loves his family more than he loves his duty. Someday maybe someone will find this and understand. Maybe someone will finish what I was too cowardly to start. The Morrison family deserves justice, even if it comes 70 years too late. Their blood is on my hands, and on the hands of everyone who lets their deaths go unanswered. Ezra read the confession twice. His grandfather's words blurring as tears he hadn't expected filled his eyes. Thomas Cole hadn't been a villain. He'd been a man faced with an impossible choice, forced to choose between justice and the lives of his own children. But he'd also been a man who had never forgotten what that choice had cost him. The loose floorboard in the main room had been calling to Ezra's attention since he'd first entered the lodge. But only now did he understand why his grandfather might have chosen this particular hiding place. It was directly in front of the fireplace, where someone sitting in contemplation might absently worry at the edge with their boot until it came free. Beneath the board, in a space that had been carefully hollowed out, Ezra found his grandfather's final secret. A full confession written on official Cedar Falls County Sheriff's Department letterhead, signed and dated September. To whom it may concern, the document began in Thomas Cole's precise handwriting. I, Sheriff Thomas Cole, hereby confess to obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal murder, and dereliction of duty in the matter of the Morrison family disappearance. What followed was a detailed account that filled in gaps Ezra hadn't even known existed. His grandfather had documented everything. The exact location where the bodies were buried, the names of Blackwood's associates, the methods used to intimidate other potential witnesses, and the broader network of corruption that extended throughout the county. Robert Blackwood controls this county through a combination of economic leverage and direct threats. His timber operations employ half the men in Cedar Falls. His money finances the campaigns of judges, county commissioners, and selectmen. Those who can't be bought are intimidated through threats to their families or mysterious accidents that befall their property. When James Morrison refused to sell the Mountain View Lodge, Blackwood decided to make an example of him. The murder was planned and executed with military precision by 3 men Blackwood hired from Chicago: Vincent Torino, Marcus Webb, and a man known only as the Swede. They killed the family on the night of September 15, 1952, and buried the bodies in a ravine approximately 2 miles northwest of the lodge. I was ordered to report that the Morrison family had simply left town, abandoning their property due to financial difficulties. When pressed by Blackwood, I filed a false report stating that Morrison had gambling debts in Chicago and had fled to avoid his creditors. The story was accepted because it explained why no forwarding address was left and why no one came looking for them. The truth is that Mary Morrison's sister in Chicago did try to contact them through my office in October 1952. I told her that the family had moved on without leaving word of their destination. When she threatened to hire a private investigator, Blackwood had one of his men visit her apartment. She stopped asking questions after that. Ezra felt sick reading his grandfather's clinical documentation of his own moral failure, but as he continued reading, he began to understand the impossible position Thomas Cole had found himself in. Blackwood's threats against my family were not idle. In November 1952, Judge Harold Peterson attempted to investigate irregularities in timber contracts. His house burned down while his family slept. Only luck and a neighbor's quick action saved their lives. Peterson withdrew his investigation the next day and accepted early retirement. In January 1953, reporter Sarah Mitchell from the Cedar Falls Gazette began asking questions about the Morrison family's disappearance. She was found beaten unconscious in an alley behind the newspaper office. Her editor killed the story and transferred her to the society page. She left town within the month. I tell myself that I saved 4 lives by sacrificing 3, but I know the truth. I was a coward who chose personal safety over justice. The Morrison family died because they believed in something worth fighting for. I lived because I abandoned everything I claimed to believe in. The confession continued for several more pages, detailing how Blackwood had systematically eliminated anyone who might pose a threat to his empire. Business rivals who suffered mysterious accidents, environmental activists who disappeared on hunting trips, even a federal investigator who died in a car crash on a mountain road that locals said was perfectly safe. But it was the final section that revealed the full scope of his grandfather's anguish. I have lived with this burden for 23 years. Every badge I pinned on, every oath I swore, every time I promised justice to a victim's family, I was living a lie. The Morrison family deserved better from the law they trusted to protect them. I am leaving this confession where someone might eventually find it. Perhaps time will reveal what immediate action could not. Perhaps someone with more courage than I possessed will finish what should have been done in. If that person is reading this, know that the Morrison family is buried beneath 3 large stones arranged in a triangle, in the ravine where Willow Creek makes its first bend northwest of the lodge. They deserve a proper burial, proper remembrance, and proper justice. May God forgive me, for I cannot forgive myself. The confession was signed Thomas Cole, former sheriff, in handwriting that grew increasingly unsteady toward the end. Following his grandfather's directions, Ezra found Willow Creek's first bend exactly where the confession had indicated. The ravine was deeper than he'd expected, carved by decades of spring runoff and hidden by a thick canopy of pine and aspen that filtered the afternoon sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and green. He almost missed the burial site entirely. 71 years of forest growth had obscured much of the original landscape, and what his grandfather had described as 3 large stones arranged in a triangle now looked like nothing more than natural rock formations, partially buried under layers of fallen leaves and forest debris. But when Ezra cleared away the organic matter, the deliberate arrangement became obvious. 3 granite boulders, each roughly the size of a wagon wheel, formed a perfect triangle with sides measuring approximately 6 feet each. Someone had placed them with, creating a marker that would endure long after wooden crosses or metal plaques had succumbed to weather and time. In the center of the triangle, Ezra found what he'd been looking for: a small metal box, green with corrosion but still intact after 7 decades in the Montana wilderness. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas, was a hand-drawn map that his grandfather had created as a final act of documentation. The map was remarkably detailed, showing not just the burial location, but the entire sequence of events from that terrible night in September. Thomas Cole had reconstructed Blackwood's crime scene with the thoroughness of a trained investigator, even though he'd been forbidden from conducting an official investigation. Penciled notations marked key locations: lodge, family killed here between 11 p.m. and midnight. Truck parked here, tire tracks photographed, but photos destroyed on Blackwood's orders. Bodies carried down this path, broken branches and disturbed ground, noted but not officially documented. Burial site: 3 graves dug to maximum depth possible, in rocky soil. But it was the detailed sketch on the map's reverse side that proved most valuable. Thomas Cole had drawn the crime scene inside the lodge itself, showing the exact positions where each family member had been found. James Morrison in the main room near the fireplace, apparently killed while trying to defend his family. Mary Morrison at the foot of the stairs, struck down while fleeing toward her daughter's room. Sarah Morrison in her bedroom, where she'd hidden under her bed but couldn't escape her killers. His grandfather had even noted the murder weapons. James Morrison's single gunshot to chest, .45 caliber. Mary Morrison, blunt force trauma to head, consistent with rifle butt. Sarah Morrison's suffocation, likely smothered with pillow to avoid noise. The clinical details sickened Ezra, but they also provided the kind of specific evidence that could reopen a case even after 7 decades. His grandfather might have been forced into silence in 1952, but he documented everything with the hope that someday justice would be possible. At the bottom of the map, in smaller handwriting, Thomas Cole had added a final note. Blackwood's men were professionals. They left no physical evidence in the lodge, except what I observed and documented here. The murder weapons were disposed of in Copper Lake, weighted down and dropped in the deepest part. Blackwood himself never entered the lodge, maintaining plausible deniability. Ezra studied the map by the fading light filtering through the forest canopy. His grandfather had been far more than a complicit coward. He'd been a secret investigator, gathering evidence while appearing to comply with Blackwood's demands for silence. Thomas Cole had risked everything to ensure that someday, when the time was right, the truth could emerge. The burial site itself showed signs of his grandfather's final act of defiance. Instead of the shallow, unmarked graves that Blackwood's men would have preferred, someone had dug proper graves and arranged the stone markers with care. Someone had treated the Morrison family with the dignity in death that they'd been denied in their final moments of life. Standing in the forest silence, surrounded by the natural cathedral of towering pines, Ezra understood that he was the person his grandfather had hoped would eventually find this place. Thomas Cole had spent 23 years carrying the weight of his silence, but he'd also spent those years preparing for the day when that silence could finally be broken. The Morrison family had been waiting 71 years for someone to speak for them. They'd waited long enough. Ezra carefully folded the map and placed it back in the metal box. Tomorrow, he would return with proper tools and begin the process of giving James, Mary, and Sarah Morrison the justice they deserved. But tonight, he would keep vigil in this sacred place where his grandfather's conscience had finally found peace. Back at the lodge, as darkness settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, Ezra continued his systematic search for evidence his grandfather might have left behind. It was in Sarah Morrison's bedroom, tucked beneath the loose corner of a floorboard near her small bed, that he found the most heartbreaking artifact of all: Sarah's own diary, written in the careful cursive of a child just learning to express her thoughts on paper. The diary was small, bound in pink leather, with a tiny brass clasp that had somehow survived 7 decades of mountain weather. Sarah had received it for her 8th birthday in July 1952, just 2 months before her death. The early entries were filled with the ordinary concerns of childhood: a favorite doll, excitement about starting 3rd grade in the fall, her father teaching her to fish in Willow Creek. But as the entries progressed through late summer and into September, Sarah's writing revealed a child's growing awareness that something terrible was approaching her family. August 30, 1952. Daddy was cleaning his rifle again today. He does that when he's worried about something but doesn't want to tell Mama and me. I asked him if we were going hunting soon, and he said maybe, but his eyes looked sad. I don't think we're going hunting for deer. September 2, 1952. Mama has been pressing flowers again. She says it helps her think, but I think it helps her not cry. She pressed some poisonous ones today, which seems strange because Mama usually only presses pretty ones. Maybe she's trying to remember which ones to stay away from. September 5, 1952. 3 men came to visit Daddy today. They weren't nice men. I could tell because Mama made me go upstairs, but I listened from the top of the steps. One of them had a voice like gravel, and he said Daddy was making a mistake. After they left, Daddy held me and Mama very tight and said he loved us more than anything in the world. September 8, 1952. I heard Mama and Daddy talking about Chicago again. Not the good things like deep dish pizza and the big lake, but the bad things that made us leave. Daddy said some problems follow you no matter how far you run. I don't want to run anymore. I like it here. I like my room and the way the mountains look in the morning. The entries became increasingly poignant as Sarah documented her parents' growing fear while maintaining the innocent perspective of a child who didn't fully understand what was happening around her. September 2. The telephone doesn't work anymore. Daddy says a tree must have fallen on the wires, but I didn't hear any storm last night. Mama made me promise to stay very close to the lodge and not go down to the creek alone, even during the day. She said it like it was very important, so I promised. September 14, 1952. I found Mama crying in the kitchen this morning. She was looking at a photograph of her sister in Chicago, the one who sent me birthday money. When I asked if we could visit Aunt Helen soon, Mama hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She said sometimes people we love have to stay in our hearts, instead of in our arms. The final entry, dated September 15, 1952, was written in handwriting that showed the strain of a child trying to be brave while terrifying events unfolded around her. Something bad is going to happen tonight. I can feel it the way you can feel a storm coming, even when the sky is still blue. Daddy has his rifle by the front door and he keeps looking out the windows. Mama packed some of our things in a bag, but then she unpacked them again like she changed her mind. I'm not supposed to know, but I heard them talking about the root cellar behind the kitchen. Mama said if the bad men come, I should hide there and not come out no matter what I hear. She made me promise, and when I promised she cried again. I'm scared, but I don't want Mama and Daddy to know, because they're already scared enough for all of us. I'm going to keep my wooden horse with me tonight. Daddy made it special, and he said it would always keep me safe. Maybe if I hold it tight enough, it will keep all of us safe. If something happens, and I can't write in this diary anymore, I want whoever finds it to know that I love my Mama and Daddy more than all the stars in the sky. And I want them to know that we were happy here, even at the end. This lodge felt like home. The diary's final page contained a child's drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands in front of the Mountain View Lodge, with a heart drawn around them and the words, "The Morrison Family Forever," written in careful letters below. The next morning, Ezra made the 2-hour hike to Cedar Falls with a heavy pack and a heavier heart. The town had grown since his grandfather's time, but the old courthouse still dominated the central square, its stone facade weathered but solid. The Cedar Falls County Clerk's office occupied the building's first floor, where decades of legal documents were stored in climate-controlled archives. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Janet Morrison, no relation to the murdered family, despite the name, was helpful once Ezra explained he was researching property records for the Mountain View Lodge. What he found in the probate files from 1953 made his blood run cold. Robert Blackwood's last will and testament, filed after his death in 1978, revealed the scope of an empire built on blood and intimidation. But more shocking was the discovery that the Blackwood family still controlled significant portions of Cedar Falls County, including the current mayor's office. the largest construction company, and a network of businesses that employed nearly 40% of the local workforce. The will itself was a masterpiece of legal maneuvering that ensured the family's power would continue across generations. Robert Blackwood had established a trust that would benefit his descendants while maintaining their control over key county positions. The current beneficiaries included Mayor Richard Blackwood, Robert's grandson, and several cousins who held positions on the county commission and school board. But it was an addendum to the will, filed separately and marked confidential until 1999, that contained the most damaging information. In it, Robert Blackwood had documented his crimes with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable, even in death. I, Robert Blackwood, being of sound mind and body, do hereby acknowledge certain actions taken in the course of building my business empire that may be viewed unfavorably by future generations. However, I maintain that these actions were necessary for the economic development of Cedar Falls County and the prosperity of its citizens. The acquisition of the Mountain View Lodge property in 1952 required the removal of obstacles that threatened my timber operations. The Morrison family proved unwilling to negotiate in good faith, despite generous offers for their property. Their refusal to sell necessitated more direct action. I engaged the services of Vincent Torino, Marcus Webb, and Eric Anderson to resolve this business dispute permanently. The family was eliminated on September 15, 1952, and their remains disposed of in accordance with my instruction. Sheriff Thomas Cole was persuaded to file appropriate reports that would prevent unnecessary investigations. This action, while regrettable in its necessity, prevented a precedent that would have encouraged other property owners to resist legitimate business development. The economic growth that followed vindicated my decision and benefited the entire community. I trust that my descendants will understand that successful men must sometimes make difficult choices for the greater good. The methods I employed may not be suitable for modern business practices, but they achieved their intended purpose. Ezra stared at the document with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Robert Blackwood had confessed to murder in his own will, describing the elimination of an innocent family as a business dispute and their deaths as regrettable necessity. The arrogance was breathtaking, but it was also legally admissible evidence of first-degree murder. The will continued with specific instructions that revealed the ongoing conspiracy to suppress the truth. Should questions arise regarding the events of 1952, my heirs are instructed to maintain the official narrative established at that time. The Morrison family abandoned their property due to financial difficulties and departed the county of their own volition. Any evidence to the contrary should be dismissed as unreliable speculation. The success of our family depends on preserving the reputation I have built through decades of hard work and difficult decisions. Unity of purpose and message will ensure continued prosperity for future generations. Janet Morrison looked over Ezra's shoulder as he photographed the document with his phone. "That's unusual," she said. "Most people don't confess to crimes in their wills. Most people aren't sociopaths." Ezra replied grimly, "Are you going to do something with this information?" Ezra looked up at her. Janet Morrison was approximately the same age Sarah Morrison would have been if she'd lived to grow up, marry, and build a life in the town where she'd been murdered. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to make sure the truth finally comes out." "Good," Janet said quietly. "Some secrets are too heavy for a community to carry forever." As Ezra left the courthouse, he realized that his mission had evolved beyond simply honoring his grandfather's memory or seeking justice for the Morrison family. He was now carrying evidence that could destroy the political and economic structure that had controlled Cedar Falls County for 70 years. Back at the lodge, Ezra made one final search of James Morrison's makeshift office, hidden behind the last drawer of the roll-top desk, in a space so narrow it could only be reached by someone with small hands. He discovered the Morrison family's insurance policy against their killers, a metal box containing photographs, documents, and recordings that James had secretly gathered in his final weeks of life. The centerpiece of the collection was a small recording device, primitive by modern standards, but sophisticated for 1952. James Morrison had somehow managed to record his final conversation with Robert Blackwood, capturing the timber baron's threats in his own voice. The wax cylinder was cracked with age, but Ezra's military experience with various recording equipment suggested it might still be playable with the right equipment. More immediately useful were the photographs James had taken using a telephoto lens borrowed from a fellow veteran who worked as a newspaper photographer. The images documented everything: Blackwood's men surveilling the lodge, license plates of vehicles used in the intimidation campaign, and most damning of all, a clear photograph of Robert Blackwood himself meeting with the three killers outside the Cedar Falls Municipal Building. But it was James Morrison's final letter, addressed to any law enforcement officer with integrity, that provided the most comprehensive evidence package Ezra had yet discovered. My name is James Morrison, formerly Sergeant James Morrison of the 59th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. I am writing this letter because I believe my family and I will be murdered within the next 48 hours by agents of Robert Blackwood, owner of Blackwood Timber Corporation. I have served my country with honor in 2 combat deployments and earned the Bronze Star for actions at Normandy. I mention this not to boast, but to establish that I am not a man given to hysteria or wild accusation. What I document in this letter is based on careful observation and evidence gathering, conducted over the past 3 weeks. Robert Blackwood has demanded that I sell him the Mountain View Lodge property for a fraction of its value. When I refused, he escalated to increasingly serious threats against my wife Mary and daughter Sarah. These threats have included 1. Sabotage of our telephone lines to isolate us from outside help. 2. Surveillance of our property by armed men. Direct threats of violence delivered by Blackwood personally. 4. Implied threats against other families who might resist his business practices. I have documented these activities with photographs and recordings included with this letter. I have also prepared maps showing the exact locations where Blackwood's men have established observation posts around our property. If my family and I disappear or die under suspicious circumstances, I request that any honest law enforcement official investigate Robert Blackwood as the primary suspect. I have reason to believe he has corrupted local authorities, so this evidence should be shared with state or federal investigators. My wife Mary and daughter Sarah are innocent victims in this dispute. They deserve justice if I am unable to protect them. Please do not let our deaths be covered up as accidents or disappearances. We are being murdered for refusing to surrender our property to a criminal enterprise. I have hidden copies of this evidence in multiple locations. If one cache is discovered and destroyed, others will remain. The truth will survive even if we do not. The letter was signed and notarized, giving it additional legal weight. James Morrison had thought of everything, creating a comprehensive case file that would be admissible in any court. He'd understood that his military background would lend credibility to his accusations, and had presented his evidence with the thoroughness of a trained intelligence officer. At the bottom of the metal box, Ezra found one final item that nearly broke his composure: a small envelope marked for Sarah, if she survives. Inside was a letter from father to daughter, written in the gentle tone James had probably used when reading her bedtime stories. My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, it means Daddy couldn't protect you and Mama from the bad men, but someone else found you and kept you safe. I want you to know that everything Daddy did, he did because he loves you more than life itself. You are the bravest, kindest, most wonderful little girl in the world, and I know you will grow up to do amazing things. Remember that Daddy and Mama will always be watching over you, even when you can't see us. The wooden horse I made for you has a secret. If you press on its left ear and turn it clockwise, a small compartment will open. Inside is Mama's wedding ring and some money I saved for your education. Use them to build the life Mama and I dreamed of for you. Be brave, my sweet girl. Make us proud. Ezra set the letter down with trembling hands, understanding that he now carried the complete story of the Morrison family tragedy. The Cedar Falls Gazette building hadn't changed much since 1952. though computers had replaced the old typesetting equipment and the printing presses had been moved to a more modern facility across town. In the basement archives, surrounded by bound volumes dating back to the town's founding in 1898, Ezra found the newspaper coverage that confirmed everything he'd suspected about the Morrison family cover-up. The bound volume for October 1952 contained the article that had sealed the Morrison family's fate in the public record. The headline read, "Lodge owners abandoned property, skip town," and the story that followed was a masterpiece of misdirection written by someone who knew exactly how to bury the truth beneath layers of seemingly reasonable explanation. Local businessman James Morrison and his family have abandoned the Mountain View Lodge property after less than 2 months of operation, according to Sheriff Thomas Cole. Morrison, who purchased the lodge in August with plans to operate it as a tourist destination, apparently left town suddenly due to undisclosed financial difficulties. "These folks got in over their heads," Sheriff Cole explained to this reporter. "Operating a remote lodge requires significant capital and experience that Mr. Morrison apparently lacked. When the bills started piling up, they decided to cut their losses and move on." Morrison had indicated to several local merchants that he was having trouble meeting his supply orders and payroll obligations. The family was reportedly seen loading their vehicle with personal belongings on the evening of September 16, though no forwarding address was provided to neighbors or business associates. "It's unfortunate, but not uncommon," noted Cedar Falls Bank President Robert Blackwood. "Many newcomers underestimate the challenges of mountain living and business operation. We wish the Morrison family well in their future endeavors." The Mountain View Lodge property will be offered for sale through the county tax assessor's office if no arrangements are made for outstanding obligations. Interested parties should contact the Cedar Falls County Clerk's office for additional information. Every line of the article had been carefully crafted to establish the official narrative while discouraging further investigation. Sheriff Cole's quotes provided law enforcement credibility, while Robert Blackwood's comment as bank president gave the story financial legitimacy. The mention of the family being seen loading their vehicle created a plausible explanation for their absence without requiring any actual witnesses. But it was what Ezra found in the archives for November 1952 that revealed the broader scope of the conspiracy. A small item buried on page 6 reported that Chicago attorney Margaret Morrison had contacted the Cedar Falls Sheriff's Department seeking information about her missing brother and his family, but that no assistance could be provided regarding individuals who had departed the county voluntarily. Margaret Morrison had been Mary's sister, the one who'd sent Sarah birthday money and appeared in the family photographs. She'd tried to find her missing relatives, but the official story had been sufficient to discourage her investigation. In an era before social media and widespread communication, a family could disappear into the vast American landscape and never be found by those who loved them. The final piece of the newspaper puzzle appeared in the December 1952 edition: Mountain View Lodge property sold at tax auction. Robert Blackwood had purchased the lodge and surrounding 200 acres for exactly $847, the amount of back taxes allegedly owed by the Morrison family. The sale price was roughly 1/10 of what James Morrison had originally paid for the property. Ezra photographed each article with meticulous care, understanding that these newspapers represented the public face of a sophisticated murder and cover-up operation. Every quote had been designed to support the false narrative while deflecting suspicion from the real perpetrators. But even more damning was what he found in the paper's internal correspondence files, stored in boxes that apparently hadn't been reviewed in decades. A memo from editor Harold Stevens to his staff, dated September 18, 1952, contained instructions that revealed the newspaper's complicity in the cover-up regarding the Morrison family situation. "We will report only what Sheriff Cole officially provides. No independent investigation or follow-up questions. No interviews with neighbors or business associates. No speculation about circumstances of departure. This is a straightforward story about failed business venture. Nothing more. Any staff member who deviates from this approach will be immediately terminated." A handwritten note attached to the memo, apparently from the newspaper's owner, made the source of these instructions clear: HS Blackwood has made it clear that our advertising revenue depends on responsible reporting of local business matters. Please ensure staff understands the importance of community cooperation. WH The Morrison family hadn't just been murdered and buried in an unmarked grave. They'd been systematically erased from the historical record by a conspiracy that included law enforcement, local government, financial institutions, and the press. 3 weeks later, Ezra stood in the Willow Creek ravine with FBI agent Maria Santos, Montana State Police Detective John Hoffman, and a forensic recovery team that had traveled from the state crime lab in Missoula. The excavation had taken 2 days, but they'd found exactly what Thomas Cole's map had promised: 3 graves containing the remains of James, Mary, and Sarah Morrison. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Patricia Wells, worked with reverent precision as she examined the remains. "The preservation is remarkable," she told the assembled investigators. "The rocky soil and dry climate created ideal conditions. We'll be able to determine exact cause of death and potentially extract DNA for positive identification." Agent Santos held the evidence that Ezra had compiled over the past month: his grandfather's confession and crime scene map, Mary Morrison's coded botanical journal, James Morrison's hidden photographs and recordings, Robert Blackwood's arrogant will, and the newspaper articles that documented the cover-up. "This is the most comprehensive cold case file I've ever seen," she said. "Your grandfather did everything except officially solve the crime." But it was the memorial stone that Ezra had commissioned from a local craftsman that transformed the burial site from a crime scene into a sacred place. The granite monument, simple but elegant, bore an inscription that honored the Morrison family while acknowledging the long delay in providing them justice. "In memory of James Morrison, 1919-1952, Mary Morrison, 1921-1952, Sarah Morrison, 1944-1952, a family who sought a new beginning. In these mountains they loved. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. The eternal years of God are hers." William Cullen Bryant. "Justice delayed is not justice denied." September 15, 2023. The date marked exactly 71 years since their murder, a span of time that encompassed entire lifetimes, but had not diminished the power of truth to emerge from darkness. Detective Hoffman had spent the previous week interviewing surviving members of the Blackwood family and their associates. Mayor Richard Blackwood had initially denied any knowledge of his grandfather's crimes, but the evidence was overwhelming. Robert Blackwood's own will served as a confession that no amount of political influence could suppress. "The mayor's resigned," Hoffman told Ezra as they watched the forensic team carefully transport the remains to the medical examiner's van. 3 county commissioners have stepped down, and the district attorneys opened investigations into every Blackwood business contract going back 20 years. "It's going to take months to unravel the full scope of the corruption." Agent Santos nodded grimly. "Organized crime families usually don't last 3 generations without someone making a mistake. Robert Blackwood's mistake was documenting his crimes in legal documents that eventually became public record. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, casting the ravine in deep shadow, Ezra found himself alone with the memorial stone he'd placed at the head of the burial site. The Morrison family had finally received the recognition they deserved, but more importantly, they'd received justice. The wooden horse that Sarah Morrison had treasured sat at the base of the memorial, along with flowers that Mary Morrison might have pressed in her botanical collection and a small American flag honoring James Morrison's military service. Ezra had decided to leave Sarah's toy where she could rest, knowing it was nearby, fulfilling her father's promise that it would always keep her safe. "I'm sorry it took so long," Ezra said quietly, his words carried away by the mountain wind. "But your story is finally being told." The investigation would continue for months, but the essential work was complete. The Morrison family had been restored to history, their murders acknowledged, and their killers exposed. Robert Blackwood's empire, built on their graves, was finally crumbling under the weight of truth. As Ezra walked back toward the lodge through the gathering darkness, he carried with him a sense of completion that had been missing from his life since returning from Afghanistan. His grandfather's final act of conscience had found its intended recipient, and the Morrison family's long wait for justice had ended. The Mountain View Lodge sat silent in the moonlight, no longer a monument to secrets and shame, but a testament to the truth that emerges when someone cares enough to look beneath the surface of accepted narratives. Tomorrow, Ezra would begin the process of restoring the lodge to its original purpose. But tonight he simply stood on the front porch where James Morrison had made his last stand, honoring a family's courage and his grandfather's hidden integrity. While cleaning out Sarah Morrison's bedroom to prepare it for restoration, Ezra discovered one final treasure that the investigators had somehow missed. Behind a loose board in the wall beside her bed, wrapped in a child's pillowcase that still bore faint traces of lavender sashes her mother had made, was Sarah's complete collection of carved wooden animals. The wooden horse that had sat on the hearth all these decades was just one piece of an entire menagerie that James Morrison had crafted for his daughter during their brief time at the lodge. Each animal was carved with exquisite detail and obvious love: a family of deer with delicate antlers, a bear cub sitting on its haunches, a soaring eagle with wings spread wide, and a wolf that seemed to howl silently at an invisible moon. But it was the craftsmanship that took Ezra's breath away. James Morrison had possessed the skills of a master woodcarver, turning simple blocks of pine and cedar into creatures that seemed to breathe with life. Each animal bore the kind of intricate detail that spoke of hours spent in patient creation, a father's meditation on love expressed through skilled hands. Following James Morrison's instructions from his final letter to Sarah, Ezra carefully pressed on the left ear of the wooden horse and turned it clockwise. With a soft click, a tiny compartment opened in the horse's chest, revealing exactly what James had promised. Mary Morrison's wedding ring, a simple gold band, worn smooth by years of wear, and a small roll of bills that inflation had rendered modest, but which represented a father's desperate attempt to provide for his daughter's future. More than the monetary value, though, these animals represented something profound about the Morrison family's brief time at the lodge. Despite the growing fear documented in Mary's journal and Sarah's diary, despite the escalating threats from Robert Blackwood and his men, James Morrison had continued the patient work of creating joy for his daughter. Even as danger closed in around them, he'd maintained the rituals of fatherhood that defined who he was. Each animal bore a small carved initial on its base, said M for Sarah Morrison, marking them clearly as gifts created specifically for her. But Ezra also found tiny dates carved beside the initials, tracking the progression of James's work through their final weeks at the lodge. The deer family was dated August 30. The wolf, apparently the final piece James had completed, was dated September 14, just one day before the family's murder. The implications were staggering. On September 14, 1952, with death approaching and his family in mortal danger, James Morrison had spent his final day of life carving a wolf for his 8-year-old daughter. It was an act of determined normalcy in the face of approaching darkness, a father's refusal to let fear rob his child of one last gift. The wolf itself was a masterpiece of miniature sculpture. James had captured the animal in a moment of alertness, head raised as if scenting danger on the wind. The symbolism seemed intentional, a protective spirit watching over Sarah even when her earthly guardians could no longer shield her from harm. Ezra arranged the complete collection on the small table beside Sarah's bed, the same table where she'd probably played with them during her final weeks of life. In the afternoon sunlight filtering through windows that no longer held broken glass, the carved animals seemed to come alive, a wooden ark of creatures that had survived the flood of violence that claimed their young owner. These artifacts represented more than just a father's love for his daughter. They embodied the kind of hope that persists even in the darkest circumstances, the human capacity to create beauty and meaning when destruction seems inevitable. James Morrison had faced his family's approaching death by giving life to inanimate wood, transforming his fear into something his daughter could hold and treasure. As Ezra worked to restore the Mountain View Lodge to its original grandeur, he decided that Sarah's room would become a permanent memorial space, with her wooden animals displayed exactly as she might have arranged them herself. Visitors would see not just the tragedy that had befallen the Morrison family, but the love and creativity that had flourished even in their final hours. The wooden animals would tell the story that no amount of corruption had been able to suppress, that the Morrison family had been real people with hopes and dreams and profound love for each other, and that their story deserved to be remembered and honored for generations to come. 1 year after discovering the Morrison family's tragic story, Ezra stood in the restored main room of the Mountain View Lodge with a leather-bound guest registry in his hands. This new registry, identical in design to the original, that had contained the Morrison family's final entry, represented both an ending and a beginning. The lodge had been transformed from a monument to forgotten tragedy into a living memorial that honored both the past and the future. The Montana Historical Society had provided funding for the restoration, and the FBI had donated the original evidence to create a permanent exhibit that told the complete story of the Morrison murders and the corruption that had covered them up for 7 decades. But more importantly, the lodge was once again fulfilling its original purpose. Families came to experience the mountain wilderness. Veterans sought healing in the same environment that had called to James Morrison, and researchers arrived to study the case that had exposed one of Montana's longest-running criminal conspiracies. The guest registry documented all of them, each entry a testament to life continuing in a place where death had once seemed to have the final word. Ezra opened the new registry to the first page and wrote carefully in the same spot where James Morrison had made his hopeful entry so many years before. September 15, 2024, Ezra Cole, caretaker and memorial director. 72 years after the Morrison family sought a new beginning in this place, their story has finally been told and their killers brought to justice. This lodge stands as a promise that truth endures, that love survives even death, and that some secrets are too important to remain buried forever. May all who enter here find the peace that James, Mary, and Sarah Morrison were denied, and may their memory inspire others to stand against injustice wherever it takes root. The date was significant, exactly 1 year after the discovery of the remains, and 72 years after the murders that had changed the trajectory of so many lives. The Morrison family had been properly buried in Cedar Falls Cemetery with full military honors for James, their graves marked by a monument that bore their names and the dates of their 2 brief lives. Robert Blackwood's criminal empire had collapsed completely. Mayor Richard Blackwood and 14 associates had been convicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to obstruct justice to racketeering. The Blackwood family fortune, built on decades of corruption, had been liquidated to pay restitution to the families of their grandfather's victims, including a trust fund established to maintain the Mountain View Lodge in perpetuity. Most importantly, Thomas Cole's name had been cleared. The Montana Peace Officers Association had posthumously honored Ezra's grandfather for his secret investigation and evidence gathering, recognizing him as a law enforcement officer who had served justice even when prevented from serving it openly. A plaque in the Cedar Falls courthouse now bore his name alongside other local heroes, acknowledging that courage sometimes required patience as well as action. The lodge itself had become more than just a memorial. Veterans groups held retreats in the restored guest rooms. Families dealing with trauma found healing in the mountain silence. Students studying criminology and journalism came to examine the evidence and learn how a comprehensive investigation could expose injustice decades after the fact. Sarah Morrison's bedroom had been preserved exactly as Ezra had found it, complete with her wooden animals arranged on the small table by the window. Visitors often left flowers by the collection, and children sometimes brought their own toys to share with the little girl who would never grow up but whose memory continued to touch lives across the decades. In the restored kitchen, Mary Morrison's pressed flower collection was displayed alongside information about the botanical code she had used to document her family's persecution. Botany students used her work to learn about Montana's native flora, while criminal justice students studied her methods as an example of civilian evidence gathering under extreme duress. James Morrison's military service was honored in the main room, where his bronze star was displayed alongside his unit's battle flag and photographs of the men he had served with in the 5th Parachute Infantry Regiment. His story had inspired other veterans to seek help for their own struggles with trauma and adjustment, proving that healing was possible even in the darkest circumstances. As evening settled over the mountains, Ezra closed the new guest registry and walked out onto the lodge's front porch. The same view that had welcomed the Morrison family in 1952 spread before him. Endless peaks covered in pine and aspen, valleys carved by streams that sang their way toward distant rivers, and skies so vast it seemed to hold all the possibilities the world could offer. The Morrison family had found their new beginning after all, not in life, but in the justice that had finally come to honor their memory and the love that had inspired one man to seek truth in the wilderness.